I needed a real man, she smirked. Those words cut through the air like a blade, sharp and cold. They weren't the words I had been expecting. In my head, I had rehearsed every possible scenario, every argument, every tearful goodbye. But nothing could have prepared me for this. Her smile wasn't warm. It wasn't full of regret. It was the kind of smirk you give when you know you've won, when you know you're walking away with everything, and the other person is left holding the pieces. Standing there, frozen, I couldn't help but feel like everything I had known, everything I had worked so hard for, had just shattered in a split second. 3 years, 3 years of laughter, shared dreams, quiet mornings together, and promises of forever. And now, just like that, it felt like it was all a lie. I needed a real man, she repeated, her voice firm, almost as if she were stating a fact, not a hurtful accusation. The words didn't sting as much as they should have, though. Instead, they left me numb. There was no anger at first, no outrage, just disbelief. I'd seen the signs. I had. In the last few months, they had been so obvious, scattered in front of me like breadcrumbs I had ignored, too afraid to follow. Allison had become distant. At first, I thought it was just work stress, late nights, new responsibilities. But then there were the perfumes I didn't recognize, the clothes I'd never seen before hanging in our closet, and most of all, the way she started holding her phone like it was her lifeline, a sacred object that couldn't leave her side. I never saw myself as the jealous type. I wasn't the guy who checked messages or snooped around. But somewhere deep down, I knew something was off. When she'd pull away when I tried to hug her or step outside to take calls she claimed were work-related, it felt like I was losing her. But what could I say? What could I do? She always said it was nothing, that I was just overthinking it. But now, standing in front of her, hearing the words I had dreaded for so long, I realized just how right my instincts had been. She didn't care. She didn't feel guilty. She was proud of it. I needed a real man, she said again, looking at me as if I was the one who had failed, as if I was the one who hadn't lived up to the expectation. I didn't react the way she expected. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I didn't beg. I just smiled. It wasn't a smile full of anger, but of something else. A realization that the life I thought I was living was not the one I was supposed to. So I took my keys, walked out the door, and left. I walked out the door, and the silence that followed felt deafening. It wasn't the kind of silence you experience when you're alone, but the kind that happens when something important has just ended. I couldn't remember the last time I had felt so disconnected from everything around me. My feet carried me, almost mechanically, to the car. As I sat in the driver's seat, I stared ahead, not sure where to go. The city felt foreign, like I didn't belong to it anymore. I'd always told myself that love was something you fought for, that relationships required effort, sacrifice, and understanding. But what did I really know about love? What had I been fighting for? A person who didn't care enough to be honest with me? Or was I fighting for the idea of something that had long been lost? The more I thought about it, the more I realized how blind I had been. It's easy to ignore the cracks in a relationship when you don't want to face the truth. The signs had been there all along, but I chose not to see them. How many times had I brushed off the late nights? How many times had I ignored the suspicious texts, the secretive calls, and the subtle changes in her behavior? I made excuses for her. I told myself it was just stress, just work. But in reality, I had been the one who was blind to the truth. I should have known when she stopped looking at me the same way. When she started pulling away, not just physically, but emotionally. She didn't laugh at my jokes like she used to. She didn't share her thoughts with me, didn't ask about my day. It was as if I had become a shadow in her life, something that was once important, but now just took up space. I remembered the first time we met, how everything felt so effortless. We talked for hours about nothing, but somehow it felt like everything. Her smile had been my favorite thing, and her voice was the one thing that could calm my restless mind. But now, thinking back, I realized how much I had overlooked. And the worst part? It wasn't even the betrayal. It was the way she justified it. I needed a real man. How could she say that? Did she truly believe I wasn't enough? Had I failed her in some way? As I drove, I felt my phone buzz in my pocket, pulling me out of my thoughts. I didn't even have to check it. I knew it was her. I knew it was Allison, trying to explain herself or make some kind of excuse. But I didn't want to hear it. The next morning, my phone blew up with 32 missed calls, each one from a different number I recognized, mostly from her, and a few from people I had called friends. At first, I ignored them, but they kept coming. Each call felt like a weight, pulling me back into the chaos of a life I was trying to escape. It was like a sick joke, really. My friends, the ones I had shared so many good times with, the ones who had been part of our lives together, were all on her side. They didn't see what I saw. They didn't understand the hurt that had been building up for months. They saw her as the victim, the one who had been trapped, and I was the one who had failed to meet her expectations. Jacob, my best friend, was one of the first to text me. His message was as predictable as it was painful. "Bro, you're great, but she deserves someone more established. Don't take it personally." And Chloe? She sent me a message, too, telling me she didn't want to hurt me, but maybe this was the wake-up call I needed. It hit harder than the cheating admission itself. How could they choose her side so easily? How could they believe the story she was telling? The story that painted me as the villain when all I had ever done was love her with everything I had. That night, I decided to confront Allison. I didn't want drama. I didn't want to scream or argue. I wanted the truth. So I opened the group chat with Jacob and Chloe. I asked them flat out, "Is this true? Did you all know?" Jacob's response was quick, cold even. "Bro, you're great, but Allison deserves someone more established. You'll get over it." Chloe's message came shortly after, her words hollow. "We didn't want to hurt you, but maybe this is the wake-up call you need." Her words stung, but in a strange way, they also opened my eyes. I had spent 3 years believing I was enough, but I was wrong. It wasn't about me not being enough. It was about them, Allison and my so-called friends, having their own expectations, their own agendas, and none of it had anything to do with me. The following days were a blur. I stayed in that motel on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where you didn't have to explain why you were there. It wasn't glamorous, but it was quiet. The owner, Pete, was an older guy, a bit rough around the edges, but decent enough. He knocked $20 off the weekly rate after hearing my story, which, looking back, felt like a small act of kindness in a world that had suddenly turned cold. I kept my phone off for 2 days, hiding from the barrage of texts and calls that I knew would only bring me more frustration. But when I finally turned it back on, the storm hit. 32 missed calls, 47 text messages, most from Allison, some from Jacob and Chloe, and a few from numbers I didn't recognize. But the one that caught my attention wasn't from anyone I knew. It was a notification from social media. Allison had been busy, and not in the way I thought. Her Instagram story was painting a picture of me as the villain. According to her posts, I was a controlling, jealous boyfriend who had emotionally manipulated her for years. She claimed I had isolated her from her friends and thrown violent tantrums when she stood up for herself. It stung, but more than that, it was like a punch to the gut seeing our friends, the people I trusted, buy into her narrative. I'd never seen myself as the bad guy, but now it seemed like everyone believed her version of the story. They were all buying into the lies. One post, in particular, stood out. It was a tearful video of her, talking about how I had financially abused her by making her split all our bills 50-50. She claimed I hoarded my money while she had to work harder to support us. The hypocrisy in that statement was staggering. She made more than me. She was the one who insisted on splitting the bills that way. I knew I could fight back. I could call her out, post my side of the story. But something inside me told me it wasn't worth it. I didn't need to prove myself to anyone. The truth would come out eventually. But for now, I decided to let her dig her own grave. And then came the text from Gemma, a coworker I had known for years. Her message was brief, but it made my heart race. "Hey, you might want to check your email. Something's going around the office about you." I didn't need to ask what she was talking about. I knew. Sure enough, there was an email from HR about creating a safe workplace environment, with a thinly veiled reference to concerning behaviors from certain employees. No names mentioned, but the timing wasn't subtle. At that moment, I should have been furious. I should have been plotting my next move, preparing for a fight. But instead, I was calm. I wasn't going to let Allison drag me down any further. She had already taken enough from me, my trust, my friends, and now my reputation at work. I kept my cool, but that didn't stop the world from falling apart around me. A few days later, I walked into a local coffee shop, the one I always went to because Allison hated their coffee. But something was different. The barista, who had always been friendly, looked at me like I was something stuck to her shoe. It was obvious. Allison had been there, sharing her side of the story with anyone who would listen. I wasn't just the bad boyfriend. I was the monster in her version of the narrative. I ran into Juliana, Allison's supposed best friend, while I was picking up some clothes from storage. She was nervous, glancing around like she was afraid of being seen talking to me. "You need to be careful," she whispered, her eyes darting around. "Jay isn't just her boss. His wife? She's connected, like really connected, and Allison's been telling her you're unstable, dangerous, even." That was the moment everything changed. Juliana didn't stop there. "Before you, there was another guy. Same thing happened with him. Jay and Allison, they did the same thing to him. He left town." I felt like the floor had been pulled out from under me. The night I heard that, I spent hours digging. I searched through legal records, social media, anything I could find. And sure enough, there had been another guy, Mark, someone I'd never heard of. He had vanished around the time Allison started working with Jay. The more I uncovered, the more everything started to make sense. This wasn't just about me. It wasn't just a simple breakup. This was part of a pattern, a game that Allison and Jay had been playing for years. The next morning, I got a call from our landlord. Allison had tried to remove my name from the lease, claiming I'd abandoned the property. When that didn't work, she told him I had been threatening her. He called to warn me. It wasn't the first time. Apparently his sister had been through something similar years ago. I wasn't alone. But in that moment, I didn't care about any of it. I had already made up my mind. It felt like everything was spiraling out of control. The more I uncovered, the more I realized how deep Allison's game ran. It wasn't just her and Jay. It was a whole web of deceit that I had never seen coming. The pieces were slowly falling into place, each one more painful than the last. I hadn't planned on going to the company party. Why would I? After everything that had happened, the last place I wanted to be was surrounded by the people who had so easily turned their backs on me. But Mrs. J, the wife of Allison's boss, had other ideas. She contacted me, asking me to meet her at the party. She promised that I'd get what I deserved, the truth laid bare in front of everyone. At first I didn't know if I could go through with it, but something inside me told me that this was the moment when everything would change. I had to be there. The party was at a fancy hotel downtown. I arrived late, dressed better than I ever had for these things. I knew I wasn't going to win any friends by showing up. But I wasn't there for friends. I was there for justice. The moment I walked in, the looks were priceless. Allison almost dropped her drink. Jay's face went from red to white so fast I thought he might pass out. But here's the beautiful part. I didn't have to do anything. I didn't have to say a word. It started with Chloe, my so-called friend. She was tipsy, and when she saw me, she immediately approached me. "You've got some nerve showing up here," she slurred, loud enough for nearby groups to hear. "After everything you put Allison through." I just smiled. I didn't say anything. Instead, I looked her right in the eye. "Everything I put her through? That's interesting. Tell me more." Before Chloe could respond, Gemma stepped in. She was the one who had been quietly collecting her own evidence, screenshots of Allison bragging about her conquests in company chat groups, recordings of her planning how to spin the story with Jay. Gemma had been playing her own game, and now she was ready to expose everything. "I think we'd all like to hear the real story," Gemma said, her voice steady and loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. The next hour felt like watching dominoes fall. Mrs. J made her entrance at the perfect time. She had the tablet in hand, the projector accidentally turned on, and suddenly a slideshow of incriminating messages and photos filled the room. Allison's attempts to maintain control were falling apart in real time. She tried to laugh it off, but the truth was undeniable. Every lie, every manipulation, it was all laid bare for everyone to see. But the best part? It wasn't me who exposed her. It was her own actions, her own arrogance. Jacob, the friend who had so quickly sided with Allison, was caught on film. He had been recording everything on his phone, trying to prove his loyalty to Jay. But instead he captured Allison's complete meltdown. "You think you're so clever," she screamed at me. "You and that bitter old woman trying to ruin everything I've built. Jay loves me. We're going to have a life together." That's when Mrs. J dropped the final bombshell. Divorce papers had already been filed. She'd had enough. Jay had been promising Allison a future, the same future he had promised the other young employees. Same script, different actress. But now the truth was out. The look on Allison's face when she realized she had lost everything was priceless. She couldn't control the situation anymore. The story she had been spinning for months had unraveled in a matter of minutes. The room fell silent as everyone processed what had just happened. For the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. I didn't need to fight. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to prove anything. The truth had come out. And in the end, that was all that mattered. as the night went on, everything began to change. What started as a simple gathering turned into something I never expected. The party had become a battlefield, not for me, but for Allison. And for the first time in months, I realized something that I hadn't fully understood until now. The most powerful weapon wasn't in what I said or did. It was in how I lived my truth, and how eventually people saw who she really was. That night, I drove back to my motel room, feeling a strange peace wash over me. I didn't have to explain myself anymore. I didn't have to defend my character. The truth was out there, and the people who mattered, people like Mrs. J, Gemma, and even the quiet supporters I hadn't known existed, had all shown me that sometimes you don't need to fight. You just need to step back and let people show their true colors. I thought about everything that had happened over the past few days. Allison, Jay, Chloe, Jacob, all of them. I'd spent so much time over the past 3 years trying to be someone I wasn't. I had bent over backward to make sure everyone around me was happy, to make sure Allison was happy. But in the process, I had lost myself. And that was the lesson I learned in the end. I had been enough all along. The problem wasn't me. It was the people I had chosen to surround myself with. People who couldn't appreciate the kind of person I was. People who would turn on me in a heartbeat the moment it suited them. But here's the thing. Those people didn't matter. Not anymore. Because the truth had a funny way of making everything clear. The friends who had backed Allison. They were already dealing with their own fallout. Jacob had tried to apologize, but I wasn't interested in his words. Not after he had so easily thrown me under the bus. Chloe, too. She had tried to explain herself, but I didn't want to hear it. People like that, people who can't stand by you when you need them most, don't deserve a second chance. What I realized that night was that I didn't need validation from anyone. I didn't need to be someone else to fit into a mold. I just needed to be me. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally free. I walked away from that party with more than just the satisfaction of seeing Allison's lies unravel. I walked away with a new understanding of who I was and what I deserved. I didn't need to explain my worth. I didn't need to beg for anyone's approval. And I certainly didn't need to let anyone's mistakes define me. I woke up the next morning feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Relief. The storm had passed, but instead of feeling like I'd been battered by the wind, I felt clear, almost weightless. I didn't know where I was going yet, but for the first time, I felt like I was headed in the right direction. The weeks that followed were a blur of changes, but not in the way I had expected. For so long, I had held on to the idea of what my life should be, what I thought love should look like. But now, I was learning to let go of all that. I signed a lease for a new apartment. It wasn't the best place, but it was mine. I got a promotion at work, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was living in the shadows. The beauty of it all? It wasn't just the freedom. It was the peace that came from knowing I had made the right choice. I had walked away from a toxic relationship, from a life that was built on lies, and in doing so, I had opened myself up to something better. I didn't expect everything to turn out the way it did, but I think the universe has a way of showing us what we're really made of when we least expect it. The thing about walking away from something so broken is that it leaves space for something new, something real. As for Allison, well, I heard from her one last time. She came by the motel one afternoon, clutching a manila envelope in her hands. She tried to threaten me, claiming she had dirt on everyone and that if I didn't help her stop the fallout, she would release it all. I just laughed. Go ahead, I told her. Burn every bridge you have left. See how that works out for you. She threw the envelope at me, and inside were photos, screenshots, every piece of ammunition she had collected over the years. I took pictures of everything, then handed it back to her. Release whatever you want, I said, but look at where your previous schemes got you. I didn't hear from her after that. Her social media went dark, and the friends who had sided with her, they started to realize what they had been a part of. Jacob tried to apologize. Chloe did damage control, worried about her career, but none of it mattered. The truth was out. I had learned the most important lesson of all. The best revenge is living well. And that's exactly what I was doing now. I didn't have to fight anymore. I didn't have to prove anything to anyone. Sometimes, life has a funny way of working things out. Karma doesn't need help. It just needs an audience. And I had learned that letting people show their true colors is all the revenge anyone really needs.